Today we're starting a series called Interpreting Myshkin, where we're going to be walking through different interpretations of the phenomenal character Myshkin in Dostoevsky's works, The Idiot, from the lesser-known interpretations to his more well-known interpretations. In this video, we're going to be talking about two main interpretations, which I categorize into the same category, which is Myshkin as an antichrist or Myshkin as suffering from hubris. Now, before we talk into those two different interpretations directly, I want to talk about the context for a bit, because understanding the context of a book, of the writer, is a very important stage in understanding more about how we're meant to approach a certain character or a certain element of the book. And this main comparison in the contextual sense is between the early drafts of Myshkin and the later drafts and letters of Myshkin. So in the early drafts of Myshkin, we get Myshkin being presented as a hypocritical, proud, and vengeful being, which is a very different presentation from the later Myshkin or the later drafts, where Dostoevsky is talking about writing a positively good human being in the likes of Don Quixote or Jean Valjean from Victor Hugo's novel. So there definitely is that discussion, or that room for discussion, when you're thinking about, well, how much did that early draft of Myshkin reach its second later drafts of Myshkin, even if Dostoevsky intended to change the approach? Perhaps some of the elements from the first draft remains and then leads to these interpretations of Myshkin as Antichrist or as someone suffering from hubris. Now, with the context in mind, let's start thinking about first Janet Tucker's interpretation of Myshkin as suffering from hubris. The term hubris arises from the Greek word for pride. To conceptualize, all the Greek heroes, when they completed their tasks, all then tried to become God, and as a result, in the process of becoming God, were stricken down by their gods, and as a result, their fatal flaw was called hubris. So in the same way, there's this connotation to hubris of an attempt to become God. And in Janet Tucker's interpretation, she argues that, well, Myshkin is himself trying to become God in his attempt to control people. Even though his intentions are fundamentally good, his attempt to try to control the lives and destinies of those around him is a very strong indication that perhaps he is viewing himself as superior to others and is trying to dictate how other people are meant to live their lives. For example, in the situation of Nastasia and Rogozhin in particular, he is trying to dictate their fate in the direction of goodness. And that is a very interesting point of view, because if this was to be the case, perhaps the idea is not only the case that, well, all right, it just matters, the only thing which matters is that your intentions are good, but it also likewise matters that you are trying to let people have their own free will. Yes, you could say God has a bird's eye view to say, well, okay, these people or this set of events is the best possible world. However, for us as humans, even if we have the right intentions, even if we are trying to live out a Christian love, we cannot try to just play God and say, well, okay, you have to do that, you have to do that, you have to follow what I think is the best future for you. And in some sense, it's a very tempting thing to try to do, especially in the situation of parenting, right? You see someone growing up, or in mentorship, right? I see someone growing up, I'm trying to mentor them, and it's very tempting for me to say, well, okay, I know what's best for you, I'm going to try to make you do certain things which will be best for who you are. And it might be the case that I'm right, that these certain things are the best for who this person is. But it's not right for me to then say, well, okay, you have to follow what I'm saying and you have to do X, Y, and Z, because that's just a form of hubris. That's a form of pride for me trying to dictate into your life what I want your life to be like, instead of letting you make the decision, even if that decision is going to lead you down a poor path. And that, I think, is a more pure form of love, which we'll talk about later. But that's a more pure form of Christian existence, which is to say, well, I love you, but I'll let you make your mistakes. I'll let you suffer. I'll let you struggle. But then that is a recognition, a respect for the free will and the love that God has given you. And as a result, in some sense, in Myshkin's attempt to try to control the lives of those around him, he is suffering from that hubris instead of trying to fully just let people be and recognize that, yes, people might be fallen, people might not be living the life that is best for them, but I need to respect them and love them in spite of that. So that's an interesting perspective to read Myshkin. Another element of that is Amber Dyer's presentation of Myshkin as Antichrist. Now that might surprise you, because of course Dostoevsky views Christ as a positively good being, the archetype per se of that positively good being par excellence. But on the other hand, you have Myshkin, which is in some sense a positively good human being who's meant to be following the Christ. But at the same time, Amber Dyer says he is actually the Antichrist. So why might Amber Dyer argue for that? Well, the big reason for that is because I think what Myshkin is presenting, at least to Dyer, is saying that, well, Myshkin is presenting a deviation of the Christian love. Although he's presenting elements of it, he's not presenting the full picture. And it's precisely that deviation of the Christian message which then separates Myshkin from the Christ-like figure that he's meant to be. Now, why does that slight deviation make a big difference? Think about the devil, for example. The devil doesn't try to tempt you by saying, well, I am the enemy, I'm the devil, come, follow me, be a satanic worshipper. Of course, some people do follow that route, but most of the situation, or most of the time, the devil is saying, well, look, I'm your friend, I know things better than you. I am kind of like God. You have the picture of Satan in the garden with Eve, right, saying, well, you might not surely die if you ate that apple. You might not truly die in the sense that you think you will die. So in that sense, well, all right, he is saying a certain element of the situation, but he's only giving a certain picture of the way the world works. He's giving a certain picture of Christ, but not the full picture. And in the same way, and this is Dyer's argument, that Myshkin, by acting out of pity and compassion, instead of actually loving people, he then becomes Antichrist for not fulfilling the whole truth of the Christian love, which is a pure love for someone for who they are and not out of pity or compassion. And you might say, well, does Myshkin love out of pity and compassion? The answer is yes. For example, he describes his love for Nastasia as he's loving her out of pity. He's loving her out of pity, not necessarily because he loves her as herself. Of course, he does have some sense of love towards her, but that love is a form of pity, and he pities her. And why is pity so dangerous, you may ask? Well, because pity is fundamentally a form tying to hubris of saying, well, I pity you because you're beneath me. I don't pity Elon Musk because Elon Musk is richer than me. I don't pity him at all. But I might feel pity towards a beggar in the street because, well, they're homeless. I have a roof over my head. I pity them. Now, is that necessarily a bad emotion? Well, no. I think it calls attention to people in need. But nevertheless, if you're going to then love them because of the pity, instead of loving them for who they are, you create an interesting dynamic where you're loving them and you're looking down on them and you're loving them because of this relationship. You're loving that relationship and not the person themselves. True Christian love says, I love Elon Musk and I love the beggar alike because of who they are, intrinsically of who they are. Not because one person's richer than me, not because one's lower than me, not because one person might have more money, whatever those circumstances might be which may lead to this type of relationship. I love them because of who they are, not because of the circumstances they're in. It's non-circumstantial. It's deontological, perhaps, in its truest sense. It's categorical, because you love them for who they are and not because of any circumstances around them. But Myshkin doesn't necessarily embody that true, pure Christian love, but rather loves Nastasia out of pity. And in that sense, you could say, well, perhaps Myshkin is right, Dyer is right in her interpretation of Myshkin as that Antichrist, because he is not truly loving in the correct way. Now, compassion. What's wrong about compassion? Well, compassion itself isn't wrong, but I think the way in which Dyer presents it is very interesting. She says, well, all right, what the type of compassion we're talking about is not the Christian compassion, but it's a form of secular compassion, in the sense that instead of saying, I forgive you of your sins, and I still love you in spite of your sins, Myshkin is following the Rousseauian, the Enlightenment route, by saying, well, actually, I will deny the existence of sin at all. I will ignore the existence of sin and just love you regardless of whatever is going on. I don't care about that, and I'll just love you anyways. And that is where the problem arises. The Christian message stems from two clear facts. The kingdom of heaven's at hand, and that means you are a sinner. And number two, that God recognizes and loves you and died for your sins. There is a recognition of sin at the core of the Christian message. Christian comparison says, I know you have sin. I'm a sinful person, but I love you and I recognize your sin. I forgive your sin. Sin exists. But in Rousseau's view, and perhaps in Myshkin's view, and you see that in his treatment of Marie, perhaps that's the best example of this situation, he seems to deny the existence of sin in the sense of he's saying, well, actually, hold up a second. I don't really accept that your sin exists. I would ignore it. I'll love you and I wouldn't care about that sin. And sometimes that has a very horrible turn because the character, Marie, she might want that forgiveness of sin because humans recognize our sin in the sense of crime and punishment. We recognize our sins and we know we deserve punishment for it, and we want to seek a forgiveness, a recognition of that sin, an overcoming of it, not just to say that sin doesn't exist. If I killed someone, right, if Rogozhin kills someone, he doesn't want someone to say to him, well, say, all right, your sin doesn't exist. Killing people isn't bad. That's not what he's trying to say. He's trying to say, well, actually, no, yes, your sin exists. Yes, you've fallen. Yes, you're a bad human being. Yes, you deserve hell, but I forgive you nonetheless. That is Christian love. by saying, in a Rousseauian sense, well, saying, well, humans are all good. Sin is only a byproduct of the bad nature they're in. Everywhere man is born free, sinless, but everywhere he's in chains, he's fallen into sin because of his social environments. Well, then you're denying sin, and that's not helpful for other people. And as a result, Marie dies in a very horrible, suffering situation because her sin is never truly forgiven. It's purely ignored. And in that sense, you can say, well, perhaps it's right. Mushkin is the Antichrist in some sense because he doesn't fully embody the Christian love. So that's our analysis of Mushkin's interpretation as an Antichrist or hubris. Let me know your thoughts about this interpretation below, or your thoughts about Mushkin in general. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking more about different interpretations of Mushkin, so I can't wait to share. Today, we're going to be talking about interpreting Mushkin as a symbolic representation of the conflict between worlds. We're talking about different worlds as in the otherworldly, the religious, and the human, the demonic. This challenge centers around one key question. Is there room for goodness in this world? Can it be possible to live an otherworldly life, yet at the same time serve and succeed in the world that we are living around us? Now, before we get into talking about these few different aspects, I'd like to think first about what do we mean by those two worlds, because someone who might not have interacted with Myshkin before or Dostoevsky before and has no knowledge of the Christian message might feel quite confused about this representation. Well, quite simply put it, the idea of worlds here is best represented by the gospel message of one cannot serve two masters. One either loves one or hates the other. I am not of the world, I am from beyond in the Gospel of John. In the same way, the idea of is there goodness in the world, well, we're talking about a clash between the religious, the divine, and also what can be seen as worldly passions like money, lust, desire, greed, and all these earthly possessions. Therefore, we are going to be thinking about, well, can you be good, maintain that otherworldliness, but also be successful in this world? And I think Myshkin is a very good example of that in Dostoevsky's works. Now let's get started by thinking about why does Myshkin represent this conflict very well. The biggest reason for this is because although Myshkin is presented as that positively good human being in Dostoevsky's notes and his letters, it does seem to suggest that Myshkin doesn't actually succeed in his mission. He saves no one, Nastasia dies, Rogozhin suffers, kills Nastasia. Everyone he tries to help seems to go down a negative route, and even himself, he ends up in epilepsy. The story seems to regress and fall back upon itself. Myshkin ends up where he started, or if not even worse than where he started, but only left a trail of destruction on his waist behind him. And as a result, some people have looked at that and says, well, actually the goodness of Myshkin, that positively good human being, doesn't actually save people around him, and as a result, it can be seen as a good example, a cautionary tale perhaps, of why the conflict between worlds leads to the idea that the otherworldliness is unable to conquer the worldliness. Now, that can be a potential reading, but I don't necessarily think it is a correct reading. Just that one example does not successfully prove a rule. One potential counterexample, although it would disprove a rule, does not necessarily mean that when you're talking about human nature, which is so dialectical, which is full of struggle and unpredictability, there is good reason to suggest that, well, actually, perhaps, even though Myshkin didn't succeed, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying it anyways. Because the reality is, everyone who reads Myshkin, or at least most people who read Myshkin, come out of the novel with a new sense of awe, with a new sense of respect. They're thinking, well, actually, I admire what Myshkin is doing. How can I live like that? So how do we balance, then, the idea that Myshkin doesn't save anyone with the idea that we actually want to be like Myshkin? Well, I think a good way to think about it is to turn to two dialectical examples in Myshkin and in Dostoevsky's works. Now, when I mean dialectical, I'm not talking about an idea of a Hegelian synthesis of you having the thesis, the antithesis, and then you're trying to find a synthesis or a mediator between them, but rather we're talking about two diametrically opposed ideas, the thesis, the antithesis, which is not necessarily joined by a synthesis, but rather a transcending of the dialectic itself, which is a bit of a different concept than the synthesis. So here you have the two examples of Dmitri and the Ridiculous Man. In The Dream of the Ridiculous Man, which is a really fascinating book, you can go access, or you could think about the Ridiculous Man as someone who went to paradise. He goes to this new world, enters this new world, a sinless world, without sin, but then he enters into that world, and then what happens? His one lie, him teaching people to lie, ruins and corrupts this entire world. So in this dialectical example, it says, how one person's evil, one small bit of evil, can then ruin an entire world. On the other hand, you have Dmitri, who starts off in the Brothers Karamazov as a morally corrupt human being. He has struggles, he has a cross, he's suffering, but at the same time, via the goodness that he experiences through Alyosha, through the world around him, his small seed of hope, that small seed of goodness, is able to elevate him towards the truth and towards appraisal and honor and worship of God. So you can see Dmitri, instead of going down and ruining it, Dmitri goes from the bottom and is able to transcend via that small set of goodness. So in some sense, what this dialectical examples in Dostoevsky's work is telling us is that when you have the conflict between worlds, sometimes it doesn't need too much for someone to go from a level of baseness, of shame, of suffering, of difficulty, to be able to overcome that and transcend his individual circumstance. Yet at the same time, a small bit of evil can also very quickly lead to the destruction of the whole. So how do we tie that back to our idea about goodness doesn't save? We can think about it from this perspective. Yes, it might be right that sometimes goodness doesn't save. That can be one of those examples. But at the same time, by doing well, you might be able to save the individual. There might be a few people out there that, although you might not notice it in the beginning, you can be able to help, and they would be able to be transformed by your goodness. For example, I was meeting an old mentor of mine. Actually, he was my mentor from my old primary school. I met him for lunch very recently. It was a coincidence that we were both in Oxford, and we were talking together. And he said, well, I could never have imagined that I would have such a big influence on your life. And the same goes to me when I'm thinking about people I've mentored and helped in the past. Sometimes you don't know how that small amount of goodness can actually help people. Maybe it's not on the large scale that you want, but maybe sometimes on those personal levels, you can make a massive difference on people's lives. So the idea is that via using these dialectical examples and using these frameworks of thought, you can say, well, actually, yes, Myshkin is a very good representation of, well, okay, maybe he might not succeed in some sense, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try, because we can transform people's lives. Now, finally, I'd like to talk about Myshkin as a conflict between worlds and aesthetics as a mediator. So in some sense, you could say, well, this is somewhat Hegelian, but that's not necessarily the case, because aesthetics is a third, it's not the intermediate between the two worlds. Aesthetics is not the middle ground between the divine and the human. Now, the reason why I say aesthetics as a mediator here, and why I think Myshkin does represent this very well, is via his phrase, and I think is one of the core phrases of this work, which is, beauty will save the world. Now, what do we mean by beauty will save the world? Well, beauty will save the world can be interpreted as a lot of things. There's a beauty of redemption of Nastasia Filiponova, which can occur or might occur, which is the beauty that can save the world. One's redemption, you could have the idea of all the saints in heaven rejoicing when someone gets saved. Well, that is the beauty which will save the world. Alternatively, you could say, well, art, a beautiful presentation of an aesthetic ideal can save the world. For example, that's the Romanticist presentation of these beautiful paintings of art, which can represent, in some sense, a savior of a certain ideal in the world. Now, alternatively, you could think about aesthetics as an idea, as a mediator, as the idea that art for the sake of art is itself a representation of a more fundamental truth. For example, symbolic truth. Now, if you're thinking about why I'm saying this and how does this put together in relationship to Myshkin Between Worlds, is that Myshkin is fundamentally a heavily aesthetic idea. Myshkin is not necessarily a practical idea. You think in the world, you think of, well, okay, you have Dmitri, who's representative of a modern person, someone who suffers a lot. You have Rogozhin, a murderer. You have Nastasia, someone who has a horrible past. We can all sympathize each other directly with different characters in Dostoevsky's works. But Myshkin, in some sense, is kind of beyond. He has an otherworldly quality which we know we cannot live up to. It's a different standard that we cannot live up to. For example, when you're thinking about Christ, a positively good human being, we look up to Christ, not because we are the same as Christ, but because it's an ideal we can aspire towards. And Myshkin has that similar artistic characteristic. Myshkin is that symbolic art figure, that form of what we can aspire towards, and as a result, via art and aesthetics as a mediator between the world and the divine, a way in which we can transcend both of these dynamics to a further realm of understanding and truth. Well, perhaps Myshkin as a conflict between worlds, even if goodness doesn't save in his circumstance, nevertheless, he does represent a fundamental truth which brings him forward in his analysis. Now, of course, this ties us back to the original question, is there room for goodness in the world? Although one could read The Idiot and feel very depressed and feel very sad about how the situation ends, I think the answer from the idiot is ultimately that there is room for goodness in the world, and that is a very important gamble that we must base our lives upon. We have seen how small amounts of goodness can transform people, and as a result, we have to have faith on our impacts on the individual. It's way too easy to look at characters like Myshkin and say, well, okay, just because one person didn't save everyone in the world, then that means a person is flawed. But sometimes all we can do, and sometimes all we need to do to fulfill God's calling in our lives, is to help that individual, to help the one, help those single individual people who need that help, and that is what we need to do, and we cannot forsake the individual in the pursuit of trying to help the herd. We're going to be talking about the character Myshkin in The Idiot through a Nietzschean lens to see some of the reasons for why some people have hypothesized that Nietzsche's conception of true Christianity came from a reading of Dostoevsky's Myshkin. Now, all of this discussion stems on the question of whether Nietzsche read The Idiot. And this is something which was brought to my attention in Walter Kaufmann's brilliant biography of Nietzsche, where he writes about how Nietzsche might have influenced or have gotten influence from Dostoevsky's presentation of The Idiot. Now, there isn't very much evidence that Nietzsche read Dostoevsky's Idiot directly, in the sense that he doesn't refer to that work specifically. We know he's read Notes from Underground in a French translation. However, his reading of The Idiot is only developed through Kaufmann's analysis of Nietzsche's works, where he describes Christ being in a sickly world. So while there isn't a direct link between Dostoevsky and Nietzsche through the work The Idiot, there is a suggestion that if Nietzsche did indeed read Notes from Underground, or in an extremely liberal French translation, there's good reasons to suggest that perhaps he did turn to other books. So now with that idea in mind, let's assume for the sake of this video that he did read The Idiot, because I do think it does indeed create quite an interesting picture of Nietzsche's interpretation of Myshkin. One element of that is the question that, well, how did Nietzsche admire Christ, and how did the role of Christ play a role in Nietzsche's Christology and philosophy? And one of those interesting elements here is tying to the idea of Nietzsche's conception of the separation between Christianity and Christ. In the work The Antichrist, Nietzsche writes that there is only one true Christian, and that Christian died on the cross. There was only one true bearer of the fundamental perfect Christian ideal, and I use perfect under a lot of restraint here. But to Nietzsche, Christ was one of the only, or if not the only, presentation of the true Christian message, precisely because even if the content of what he was teaching, and we will talk about that later a bit more, about the content of what was being taught, but rather the way in which he was affirming and presenting himself, Christ, on the cross by following his life all the way to his death, following the same ideals, affirming those values, was something that Nietzsche did admire Christ. And this is where themes in The Idiot do arise. I mean, you could call Myshkin a ridiculous character, a crazy one, a somewhat insane one, a naive one, but despite all of these qualifications, what you do get is a picture of Myshkin, who is fundamentally someone who does care about the world. He loves the world. He has certain values that he sticks through all of his different stages of his life, and no matter who he's interacting with, he is almost a monologic character, because he only presents a certain side of himself and doesn't change. He is affirming certain values in a way that is unique. And that is why a lot of people call him naive, call him the idiot, call him sickly, call him a bit mentally slow, is precisely because he's sticking to those values, even if those situations that he was put in were varied, different. He was not reactive to them. And that form of affirmation of values, which we'll talk to now, is something that Nietzsche could have gotten from Dostoevsky. So Nietzsche was perhaps looking at The Idiot and looking at Dostoevsky and saying, well, Dostoevsky has written a Christ-like figure who truly affirms his values to the point of death. And that is a form of a will to power, an affirmation of one's values, which Nietzsche viewed as fundamentally profound and helpful. Most notably is Nietzsche's views on the will to power. Nietzsche is a very strong admirer and advocate of the will to power, which says that all fundamental values in the world, all presentations of values, can be reduced to this fundamental substructure of a will to power, where people are trying to affirm one's values. And traditionally that was seen through the hierarchy of values found within the noblemen and the peasants, whereas the slave mentality rising from the bottom was due to a lack of power, trying to invert the power structure via ressentiment, and as a result you're trying to, and that's what his criticism of the Christian and Jewish morality is, it's kind of try to change or invert the system of morals. However, what Nietzsche is saying is that, well, actually one should affirm their own values in the strongest form, and that affirmation of one's values is the core of ethical and theoretical life, and that at the end, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it is that affirmation of values which is seen as a true end of humanity. Now, what is very interesting about this idea of the will to power and how that ties back to the idiot is well, this affirmation of one's values seems not to be a thing which is seen directly in Christianity. Yet, nevertheless, he does seem to tie the idea of the will to power to Christ himself, and in more of an insidious way to the priests. And, well, how does that idea come to be? One can suggest, and I'm not saying this is what happens, one can suggest that that idea arose fundamentally from Nietzsche's reading of the idiot by looking at how Myshkin was such a positively good human being in his affirmation of his own values, whether they were right or wrong. That was a fundamental element in which Nietzsche then decided to admire Christ through the reading of the Myshkinian lens, or Dostoevskian lens. And therefore, when Nietzsche, let's say Nietzsche is here, when Nietzsche is reading Christ on the cross, he is looking to Dostoevsky and is saying, well, actually, through Dostoevsky's understanding of Christ, when I'm saying there was only one Christian which died on the cross, that Christian who did affirm his values was Dostoevsky's Myshkin. But since Myshkin was viewed as a Christ-like figure, he imposed that figure onto Christ. So that is an interesting idea, but of course we know that perhaps if you're actually looking at the content, the meekness, the love, the kindness of Myshkin, Nietzsche would have disagreed with that. And this is where it comes back to, well, what does it mean that Nietzsche likes Christ or admires Christ, but at the same time dislikes Christianity? This is the difference that he makes between the content and the practice. There's the content of what one teaches and the practice of how one teaches. How one imposes themselves in the world, how one goes around the world with their values is one question. What they are actually teaching is another. And a very good way to look about that is to think about the development of sola fide through the Lutheran and even Augustinian thoughts and Pauline thoughts. To Nietzsche, the main fall of Christianity began with the Pauline interpretation of sola fide. Instead of promoting Christianity as a positive, active movement of one's values through the world, Christianity was then instead switched around to a religion based on sola fide, only faith, and not works, such that people are saved not by what they actually do, their positive affirmation of their values, but rather via their faith, mere acceptance of a Christian ideal. And as a result, the content, that insidious idea of saying, I don't need to do anything, I can just sit back, I do not need to affirm my values in the world, that was what Nietzsche was criticizing instead of the actual practice of Christ. So if you're actually asking, well, what type of Christianity should have survived for Nietzsche, Nietzsche would have argued that true Christianity, true Christianity in its positive and fullest form, does indeed come not from the content of what Christ taught, but rather an imitation, an imitatio Christi of the affirmation of one's values. The same way that Christ took his values and brought that to the cross is the same way in which one should go around their own values and bring that to their logical end. In today's video, we're going to be talking about presenting Myshkin as Christ. This is the orthodox interpretation of Dostoevsky's The Idiot and is in line with his suggestion to his niece, where he wrote that he was intending to create a truly perfect and noble man. Now, before we get into this video, I'd just like to say I've just gotten back from traveling through Germany, through Berlin and Hamburg, and I have uploaded a vlog of my trip through Berlin on my second channel, so if you want to go check that out, you could check it up in the link above. I'll put a link to that there. Now, let's get back to our video and start beginning by talking about what Dostoevsky meant by a truly perfect and noble man. Well, when we're thinking about Dostoevsky, we need to understand his progress and his movement through his life from a Christian background. He grew up in a Christian family. In fact, he learned to read through understanding and learning a book, which was basically a summary, kind of a collection of biblical stories. So he learned to read through reading the Bible, and he was deeply ingrained into that Christian message. And even when he was moving away from Christianity during his time with the Petrochevsky Circle and Belinsky, even during these times, he still had a deep affinity for the being and essence of Christ as a good moral figure. For example, you could turn to the Kantian idea where Kant argues it doesn't really matter whether Christ was divine or not, but that he embodied that beautiful image of Christianity in himself. In the same way, Dostoevsky, even in his most atheistic phases during his connections with the Belinsky and the Petrochevsky circle, was fundamentally in admiration of Christ, and that admiration of Christ didn't change, and that admiration of Christ only developed through his time in Siberia, in the prison camps, and throughout the rest of his life towards Brothers Karamazov. You could see a growing movement of that appreciation of Christ throughout his life. So when we're thinking about where does Myshkin tie into all of this, we can view Myshkin as kind of that development after Belinsky. Of course, he wrote The Idiot after his time in Siberia. So there's that movement towards and that development from the understanding of Christ, not only as that archetypal idea, but also in the more traditional Orthodox sense of Christ as the Son of God who loved, sacrificed, and died for us on the cross. So there is that element of Myshkin trying to be a model, an archetype for a truly perfect and noble man. Now, I talk about archetypes because this is something which Dostoevsky does talk quite a lot about. He says, well, there have been books in the past which tried to present this Christ-like archetype, but they haven't done so completely perfectly, which can lead one to suggest that his project with Idiot was to try to create a perfect book. And of course, when we're reading Dostoevsky's Idiot, we need to understand that he did not become too proud of the finished article, but he was proud of the idea behind it. So when we're thinking about what did Dostoevsky try to present with Myshkin, we need to try to figure out what is the idea behind Myshkin instead of the presentation of Myshkin itself, almost that kind of the thing in itself and what was represented by it. So we're trying to understand what was the innate idea of Myshkin as Christ. And to understand that, we need to talk about his influences, which was mainly Don Quixote from Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote and Jean Valjean from Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. Both of these books and both of these works had a great influence on Dostoevsky through his life. So if you're reading Joseph Frank's biography, you understand quite quickly that these two figures, these two books, had a great influence on what Dostoevsky conceived of as Christ. And that is to be expected. Those two were, after all, some of the most influential books, not only of our time, looking back of that period, but also of that time. Victor Hugo was, of course, just publishing Les Miserables when Dostoevsky was running around Europe. But, of course, Don Quixote was that kind of the beginning of that new genre of a novel. So Don Quixote had a very big influence on Dostoevsky, especially in his understanding of Christ. Dostoevsky writes Don Quixote as the most Christ-like figure in all of literature. And as a result, we need to think about Christ through that Don Quixote lens. And in fact, when you're thinking about what do we understand or mean by quixotic, that came from actually Don Quixote. So when we're thinking about what Dostoevsky viewed as Christ, he's not only looking at Christ as those positive attributes that we think of today, like, well, okay, it's someone who's morally virtuous, someone who's loving, someone who acts in a positive way to those around him. There also is an element of somewhat naivety or ridiculousness to his model of Christ, which I think adds a further depth to our understanding of Dostoevsky's Christ. It's not something which is very straight, saying, okay, there's a set of good values, all those values which are traditionally understood as masculine, as beautiful, as good. Of course, those are part of Christ, but there also is that kind of element of ridiculousness there to Christ, which cannot be denied. And I think that's something which Dostoevsky's contribution to Christian literature is so great, is that he's not only trying to turn to the positive aspects of Christianity, but also what some people may view as the negative aspects of Christianity as well. And I'm holding this book because this is where I wrote a recent article on Dostoevsky's Interpreting Myshkin. If you type An Unexpected Journal online, you can find my whole analysis of Myshkin and how you interpret it, which actually follows the structure of this series. I'll put a link to that below if you want to check it out. It's free access online. However, what I argue in this article is that, well, actually, yes, Myshkin as Christ represents that love, represents turning the other cheek. And that's very important. That's very true. In fact, when you're thinking about love, Myshkin as a character, his emphasis on love is so profound, the love for those around him, that it's very difficult to think of anyone who loves people in such a naive, childlike way. And perhaps when you're thinking about Christianity, you say, well, what does it mean to be like a little child, or Christ says, be like little children? Perhaps it's to love like little children, because children don't love in a kind of a biased, in a way full of hatred. They love in a more pure way. They don't care about social backgrounds. They just love people for who they are. And That's perhaps the love that Myshkin is representing and what Dostoevsky wants us to believe in. Of course, we have to remember Dostoevsky's social aims, ultimately, of believing in the redeemability of everyone's souls and the care for the outcast. That was something which was very important to Dostoevsky, right? So that love was so important. And of course, the idea of turning the other cheek was a vital element of Dostoevsky's philosophy, because in fact, if you read, I think it's Lebedev's response to Myshkin, is saying, you've done so much good for us that no one with any honor can reject you. It's like, I love you so much that everyone around you, even if they're trying to abuse you, recognize there's something different. And perhaps what Myshkin is trying to present here, what Dostoevsky is trying to present, is that sometimes, yes, is there room for goodness in this world? Hard to say, but perhaps there's this naive romanticist idea in Dostoevsky's works that, well, regardless of whether there's room for goodness in this world, you should still do that good, because ultimately people will notice you're different. And if people notice you're different, then perhaps that's all that is needed, or that's good enough to understand, well, what does Christ mean, or how do we live like Christ? We just need to be different, and by people reflecting on our difference from the world and from them, we're able to bring them towards Christ. So that's another important part of Myshkin's views on Christ. And finally, you have that ridiculousness, and I've touched upon that on Turn the Other Cheek as well, is that when we're thinking about ridiculousness in a modern setting, it's very easy to view ridiculousness in a negative way. We call someone ridiculous almost an insult in modern society, but to Dostoevsky, ridiculousness does not necessarily need to be viewed in a negative light. It could be a very positive light. In fact, the dream of a ridiculous man, what actually makes the dream of a ridiculous man ridiculous? It's almost a fantasy. He's living in an other world. But perhaps that otherworldliness is not necessarily an evil thing. Perhaps it's a good thing. Christ tells us not to be of this world, but to be of God's world. Perhaps being ridiculous is to enter into that creation, that co-creation with God of that other world, and that being ridiculous is not too evil after all. That's kind of what I want to leave you off with in this lecture series on Myshkin. I don't want to necessarily push answers on you or say you must interpret Myshkin in a certain way. Rather, I want to say, well, here are a few different interpretations of Myshkin. What are some things you can learn from us? And most importantly, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think of Myshkin? What do you learn from Myshkin? What do you learn from The Idiot? A lot of people tell me that The Idiot is one of their favorite works in Dostoevsky. Let me know if it is your favorite work in Dostoevsky, and for what reason. What stands out about Myshkin? Is it simplicity, is ridiculousness, is love? Or do you think Myshkin is more sinister, as we've discussed in previous videos? Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. And of course, go check out the article on An Unexpected Journal. You can go check it out either at paperback form, I'll put a link to this book below, or you can check it out for free on the website Unexpected Journal. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon. Have a good one.